Home is where my identity was being molded by the who's who of the cultured world, where I began to identify right from wrong, seeing through a filter, almost blinded because the filter was quite thick to see through. Home is where I learned the basics. The basics of staying shut, the basics of saying the right things at the right time, the basics of what happens if you don't fall in line, the basics of what happens if you don't behave to their set standards and expectations, the basics of subjecting myself to a predefined list of limitations. Basics of behaving in a world full of prejudice and pride, for my home was the perfect simulation of what was in store for the long ride. Home is where I learned to dream. Dream of all things I will do when I leave my home. Dream of all things I won't be allowed to do if I stay back in my home. Dream of all things I held back, I neatly packed in a box to open up when I leave. When I can declare my independence to no one in particular, but when I breathe, I breathe freely for the first time, without looking over my shoulder of who is watching, when I will begin to do the living. But home is what I started to miss pretty soon. In times when I felt unwanted, in times when I felt alone, in times when I yearned for love, but there was no one to love me, because home is where I was loved genuinely. Where I realized there are so many ways to love and be loved, and all are not what you always expected, all are not what you always desired, but love is love is love is love, and in all of its forms it is a blessing, and I was blessed to be loved. Home is where I am welcomed, where I am yearned for, where my presence is deeply missed, where despite my blatant outward disregard to their repeated invitations, my arrival is always relished, my arrival is always cherished, where my arrival is always celebrated. Almost the only place I am always welcome these days. Almost the only place where my presence is wanted these days. Home is a lot of things for me. A lot of bittersweet memories, a lot of bittersweet feelings, a lot of untold miseries, a lot of hidden internal bleeding, a little bit of differences, a lot of little adjustments, a little bit of imposing, but a lot of love and caring. But most of all, it is a part of me, as a whole, not in bits and pieces with all its imperfections and blemishes, big and small. It is where I am loved and it is where I belong. So I end this rant with a pinch of humility, because my home is my home and shall forever be my home with 100% surety. Thank you.